Lady Geek is proud to present co-hosts of the podcast series Obsessed with Abducted in Plain Sight, featuring Skye Borgman and Patrick Hinds.
And so, we can start right there. Like I said, we've all, Meredith and I have both seen Abducted in Plain Sight. And I've been familiar with the story before that just because, like Patrick, I am obsessed with true crime. So is Meredith. I watch something probably daily on something on true crime, much to the chagrin of my wife at times. But so I can definitely see why you picked this particular story to start out with. Tell us about the new show that's coming, Patrick, to lead off.
Yeah, so I have a podcast called True Crime Obsessed where we recap true crime documentaries, and Skye had reached out to us right before the film dropped on Netflix and said, you guys should really be aware of this. I think it's going to be big. And so the second it came out, we watched it and we were just like everyone. We were totally floored and overwhelmed and flabbergasted. We had so many thoughts and opinions. And after we watched it and we did our episode on it, I had Skye's email address and I was like, I'm going to be friends with her. She's a fancy director. We're going to be friends. And so we sort of kept in touch via email. And then we met up at CrimeCon in New Orleans and we went out for drinks. And it just was one of those conversations where I was like, had Skye all to myself for an hour over cocktails. And I was like, I'm going to ask you every single question. Like, what else is there to the story? How is Jan? What about the parents? Like, what was happening? And Skye was just telling me more and more, and also, a lot of the stuff that had to be left out. And so I just said to her, like, are you going to make a sequel? And she's like, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure. And I was like, well, if you're not going to do that, let's make a podcast where we can tell all the stories that got left out of the film, because there clearly was so much story left to tell. And so that's what we did.
Fantastic. And yeah, I mean, it was what, an hour and 52-minute documentary, something like that. Documentary. Yeah. And you're right. There is so much to the story that has to get packed into that time. And at the end, I was the same way. I'm like, first off, these parents, I got to know more about. I realized this was the 70s, but that I was growing up in the 70s. But yeah, there's just so much to the story. And folks, if you're not familiar with the Abducted in Plain Sight, it is available on Netflix. If you're into true crime, I highly recommend that you watch it before Monday when Patrick's podcast drops, because I tell you, this has to be, with a non-homicide angle, one of the, if not the most twisted tale of true crime that you'll come across, because it is crazy. And that's with just what they were able to show in the documentary. Now that was one of my big questions. Are we going to see more? Is there more to know? And now you saying that, definitely interested. And Skye, how did you initially become involved or come across the storyline and get involved with the documentary?
Yeah, it was really such a kind of a random thing, really, that got me introduced to this story. Jan and her mom had written a book, and you learn about the book at the end of the documentary. And they'd written a book, and it was self-published and kind of out in the world in sparing sort of quantities. They'd written the book to really share their story with people on Jan's public speaking tour. And this was in the early 2000s. And so a friend of mine found the book and read it and came to me, and she'd not really worked on documentaries before. And she said, is this a story you'd want to tell? And I got online like everybody did after they watched the film and like Googled to see if this was true. And there was nothing online, really, very limited stuff online. So it wasn't a story that was out there in the world, which is a little bit hard to believe, because pretty much every story that you hear about, I mean, every story's out there. Somebody's saying something about something. And so this one wasn't really there. And I thought it was crazy that it wasn't, but also kind of a sign of the times. And it was kind of before this true crime kind of wave of love or wave of true crimeness kind of had washed over us. So I just thought it was a great story. I didn't understand how something like this could happen, how a little girl could get kidnapped twice by the same guy. So that was really kind of what it was for me, was just exploring that and trying to find some answers.
Got you. Meredith, I've been doing all the talking.
I wanted to ask Patrick a question here, because now, to do a little bit of background check and kind of stalking you guys, I did listen to one of the True Crime Obsessed podcast episodes with Natalie Woods. And I was like, dude, what do you mean you don't know Natalie Woods?
My co-host literally took away my gay card in the middle of the episode. She's like, I'm ungay-dazzling your gay card. I know. I had, of course, heard of Natalie Wood, and I had heard, I knew that she had died, but that was really the extent of what I knew. And, I thought she died much younger. I thought this happened in the 30s. I really just didn't know anything. I made a big fool of myself in that episode, but it was a real, as I said 400 times in that episode, it was a real education. I really was. Christopher Walken was involved. So many questions.
Oh yeah. So did Robert Wagner do it or not?
I don't know. My theory truly is that they are so hammered they don't remember. I really think they were so drunk they don't remember what happened. I think they probably did get into a fight. I think Natalie Wood was like, ladies, I'm out of here, and went to get in the boat and slipped and fell in the water. I don't personally, having watched one 90-minute documentary about it, I can tell you a very informed opinion, which is that I don't think anybody murdered her. I think her death was probably accidental, but I think that there is responsibility. What he did wrong was not call the police for 4 hours because he didn't want it to be a big deal that Natalie Wood was missing. So I don't think he did it on purpose, but I think that I think that there is fault for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so when you guys got together and started talking about this, and Patrick, you already said that you had Skye's ear, and I'm sure she was a captive audience.
It was over a cocktail in New Orleans. It was a rainstorm. Skye, do you remember it was pouring in New Orleans? And I was like, all right, I'm gonna get all my questions answered.
So this is obviously not one episode podcast. This is 4 episodes, I believe, right? And you're dropping it all. What was the idea or the concept behind dropping all of them on one day?
We sort of didn't know exactly what we were doing. We didn't know exactly what we wanted to make when we started. And I think we'd initially had the idea of we'll make 15 episodes, we'll make 7 episodes. And then when we realized that it would do the best service to the story to really put it as compact as possible, and we realized that 4 episodes was the tightest, most interesting way to do this. We thought let's not drag it out. Let's give everybody what they want all at once. It's gonna hit the internet. There's so much insane information in this. It's gonna be all over again. So that was the idea, was let's just give everybody what they want all at once. I think that's the most interesting way to tell this remaining part of the story. And I think giving the audience what they want all at the same time. It's podcasting can be sort of when podcasts can be binged, I think there's a big appetite for that. And especially since it's only 4 episodes and the episodes are only about 40 minutes each, we're jamming a lot of really fascinating information into just a little short amount of time.
I think it's also too kind of what the film was like too, just a lot of information in a compact period of time. It wasn't sort of drawn out over multiple episodes. So it definitely has that feel as if it's kind of an extension of what the film was.
That's
so Skye, when you were first approached by Jan, what was your reaction to it?
By Patrick?
No, by Jan for the story. For
I see. Well, it was interesting because I mean the first real introduction I had was to the book, and it was just such a really crazy story. And then from that point on, it was just kind of a meeting with Jan and sort of talking to her and kind of figuring out if this was a partnership, or not really a partnership, but if we were the right people to tell her story, if this was a story that I wanted to sort of donate 7 years of my life to. I mean, it's been a long haul, from the moment I read the book to starting with the interviews to cutting it together to, we spent almost 1.5 years or almost 2 years on the festival circuit, and then Netflix, and then doing publicity for it after that. So it was, making the film was about 4 years, and then getting it sold was another year. And so it's a lot. It's a big commitment for me to go out and make something like this on an independent level. It was my production company, Top Knot Films, that kind of came in and did this. It wasn't a big giant production company coming in and saying, we're going to throw all this money at it. It was financed by myself and Stephanie Toby, one of the other producers on it. And so it was really an independent film to its core. And then for it to kind of get out there and get onto Netflix has been such a great thing and has really brought a lot of awareness to a story in a very timely way. I mean, if it had happened kind of at the time when we started it, it would have kind of been before the whole Me Too movement. And so just our lens and how we look at things has changed. And I think there's a little bit more understanding in how we view sexual abuse and how we talk to people about sexual abuse and all of that. So now I'll answer your question, since I kind of went off on a tangent. It was good. I mean, it was, Jan's always been very open about talking about this, and she wants the world to know her story, and her family wanted the world to know their story. I mean, they didn't get paid for this. It's not like they made a ton of money at all from this. So, and I know people have said that, but it's really their motivation, absolutely, in telling their story was so that they could save someone's life, hopefully, and so that other people would know kind of what a master manipulator does.
Yeah.
And that's
go ahead.
That's just such a big part of B, is that, yes, he is a child molester, but he's a sexual predator to the full extreme. I mean, he manipulates mom, he manipulates dad, and yes, it's in that final goal of getting to Jan, but he is able to perform with adults, and so he's not one of those restricted to just being able to be with children. He was married, he had his own children. I don't know if there was anything ever presented, was he touching his own children? I know there was the mention that there was other children that are adults that came forward and said they were molested by him as children. And we learned that he had spent some time in jail, an extraordinarily weak amount of time in jail for the at that time. But the question that I had for you, Skye, is, you can definitely see that Jan is a super strong woman. She went through, just unbelievable tragedy or trials and tragedies. But what kind of feedback are you seeing about the parents, even to this day? I mean, granted, this was another time. They were tricked, they were manipulated, but just to me, it's very hard to fathom how they had those blinders on. And I could we'll just stick to that. How has the reception been about mom and dad?
It's been pretty caustic towards Marianne and Bob Broberg. But I have seen a shift in how people feel. And I think that's happened a lot because it has brought up these conversations. And, when the film came out, people were really, really angry and really vicious, really, towards the parents on social media. I mean, social media makes it very easy to put those comments out there and not really understand that there is a real person on the other side of this. And in this case, a real person that was willing and brave enough to tell this really embarrassing, shameful story. And so that's easy to forget. But the conversation did shift, as the Brobergs were engaging with people, as we as the filmmakers were engaging with people, as people were engaging with each other, as we continued that conversation, people started understanding the manipulation that went into really targeting both of the parents as well as Jan. And if they could kind of be able to talk about this and kind of put themselves into the Broberg shoes in a little tiny way, and that conversation, we really did see it start to shift. So I know there's still a lot of people out there who feel like these parents were terrible, awful people. But at the same time, it was really a perpetrator. It was really Berchtold that came into this family and committed some atrocious crimes. And the parents got through it as best they could. And then 40 years later, when they could have just not said anything and continued on their merry way and been happy as a family, they chose to rip that scab off and to open all of this up again with the sole intention of trying to help somebody else. So I understand people's comments of how they feel about the parents negatively, but I think people are also kind of at this point starting to understand a little bit more too how something like this could have happened.
Something I noticed too, working on the podcast, I watched the film now 100 times, and I've really immersed in the film. And I realized that, and I guess this is obvious, but I think it's easy to forget this as a viewer of the film. we are being given all the information. So we know everything in a way that the parents didn't, you know. They know that Jan was taken to Mexico with their best friend. We are now calling it a kidnapping. We know that he was raping and sexually molesting her and married him, and they didn't have all of that information, you know. So it is, I remember when if you listen to our episode on True Crime Obsessed about Abducted in Plain Sight, I scream about the parents for hours. But just working with Skye on this and getting to really think about it more myself, these parents were also victims, you know.
Well, he spent.
It's also interesting too, because that's part of how the whole book happened. Was Jan went to her mom and said, "Mom, I know my part of the story. You know your part of the story. Can we put these two together and figure out all the nitty gritty?" So that's how the book came out. And eventually that's kind of how the film ended up being told as well.
And I think it's really timely, Patrick, that you guys are putting this together because, again, with that story, it's just a reiteration and it's advocacy and it's just awareness and letting people know through another avenue, so you have people who are like your Netflix coma binge watchers, and then you have the people who really listen to the podcasts more, when they're on the road or doing whatever it is, because it feels more mobile. And so you're reaching a broader audience with this message, of her story, and by sharing that story, you are letting people know, to be aware, and I mean, when it's happening to people, you don't know that you're being manipulated, and it just, but that change in mindset that you had when you were screaming, on your podcast about it, and now all of a sudden you've kind of turned it around and go, I understand now. There's a broader story here. Let's look a little deeper into it. And I think that's very important.
And the thing is B spent a long time grooming the mom and dad right along with Jan, before he ever even took her off to Mexico. There was a lot of time invested in that, a lot of trust. And in this day and age, it was said several times in the documentary, they didn't really have a clear picture of what a child molester was. Even the FBI guy, I think it was, said that we heard, stranger danger, but, or maybe I'm pulling in another documentary I watched.
That's it. Historically, it's a really interesting time for understanding child abuse and kidnapping and runaways, and especially for the FBI. I mean, this was a critical time in terms of funding for the FBI, National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, all of these clearinghouses. States would talk from state to state. This wasn't happening in the 70s. This is something that's all very new in terms of how we as a nation deal with abuse of children.
Yeah.
I also want to say too, it's interesting because Meredith, you talked about the different audiences, and I don't. While I'd love for anybody to go out there and watch Abducted in Plain Sight, I also feel like you can listen to this podcast not having seen the film. I mean, we expand on the film certainly, and we talk about things from the film, but we kind of. Patrick does this great job of sort of recapping everything and diving a little bit deeper, but they can exist on their own, but they can also really in a wonderful way exist together.
Yeah, part of what's great about that is that getting, Skye did this great interview with Jan a year later. That's a major part of the podcast. And so we get Jan's perspective on, her, how the world has reacted to her story and all of the different ways that it's affected her, because she was very public about something that was very embarrassing and traumatic, but also she then had to deal with people, their reactions towards her parents, who she loves very much and defends until the end. And so it was very interesting. Skye also pushes Jan on her dad's sexuality. Whether that's important or not, people are really curious about it. And so we got the opportunity to ask Jan, is your dad gay? And Jan's answer is very interesting. And so it was really an amazing thing, as a huge fan of the documentary, to get to see and hear Jan's new interview, which is just one of the fascinating things that's a part of the podcast.
Well, I don't care if it was the 70s or if it's the 2020s. If you're gay because you got a hand job from a guy one time, there's a lot lot of gay guys running around the country right now.
Yeah.
So
it's so complicated. And, it's, I think the idea for me as a gay person watching it was, is he gay? Was he repressed? He is a Mormon. Did that play a factor? And we really, I really wanted an answer. Is the dad gay or not? And I was really given an education both by Skye and by Jan about like how important even is that question, but we do have a really interesting discussion about it.
And that's going to be in the podcast, yes?
Oh, yes. That's in the podcast.
Wonderful.
Yes.
There's really some great stuff in the podcast that you should definitely tune into it, because we dive a little bit deeper for sure.
Yeah, there is, this is the other thing that I've been talking about from the beginning. This was the reason I wanted to make the podcast, was because there's this insane story that was in the film up until the very last week before it was, locked picture, I think is how you say it, before it was locked. Yeah. They took it out. Thank you, I did it. They took it out right before because they needed to. They needed to for the film for the pacing and all of that. But it's an insane plot line that's gonna make you lose your hair.
Well, I'm going back to what you were saying earlier about dropping it all at the same time. I'm glad you did, because I'm one of those that does binge listen, binge watch, especially being OCD. And, you find those couple of minutes or an hour that you can carve out of your day. And then it ends up being 2 hours or 3 hours because you end up, with the blinders on and digging in. And so, definitely come Monday, I will be tuning in. And, again, folks, if y'all have not watched The Abducted in Plain Sight, I really tell you, if you're into true crime, you need to. Skye did a fantastic job on that. I'm really excited to see what Patrick's putting together on this, because if there is a bunch more to tell on this side of the story, and then with the interview with Jan, there's a lot to this. It's got everything from child molestation. I mentioned a hand job in there. There's aliens. There's all. I'm telling you,
arson?
This has it all. Yeah, arson. I forgot about the arson.
I
know. There's just so much to this, and if you're a fan of Patrick's, of course, he's really going to bring it to the table, and I'm looking forward to seeing you two hook up. Now, Patrick, are there any other stories that you would like to give the deep dive, multi-podcast investigation into?
Yeah, so many. I would love to do a deep dive on Amy Berg's The Case Against Adnan Syed. I would love to do, Joe Berlinger, any of his films, and of course anything that Skye does. We already have a handshake agreement. I can podcast about it.
And I have to ask it to both of you. Have either of you or both of you heard of the missing trio from Fort Worth that was abducted in the 70s from a mall right on Christmas Eve or the day before Christmas Eve?
No,
I haven't.
But I can't Google it fast enough.
I know.
The one girl, the oldest girl, was actually my next door neighbor and my babysitter. They disappeared. 3 girls disappeared without a trace to this day. They actually pulled 2 cars out of a local lake last year looking for bodies or clues. And there's a 3rd car. They can't get it. There's a whole bunch to it. I won't go all off into it, but I'm still in contact with the brother who's heading up the search for his sister.
Wow.
But it's really intriguing, guys, because they disappeared without a trace.
Wow.
Wasn't still in their car. The car still in the parking lot of the mall. And this is right at the same time, 74. So
wow.
But anyway, so I got off track there. I just had to ask because we're in that mode.
I know.
Meredith, you had something else you wanted to ask, or were you?
You're both creative people, and you've done a lot of stories, Skye, with your documentaries, and Patrick with your podcasts, and just being this avid fan. So I wanted to know if there was any 1 or 2 stories that really stick with you that you can't get out of your head, and going beyond the story that you want to deep dive into, but the one that really bothers you.
For me, I have 2 that I always talk about. There's the case of Maura Murray, who was the young woman who went missing in New Hampshire, I think in 2004. I'm obsessed with that case. There's a lesser known missing persons case, really. Her name is Dr. Sneha Ann Phillip, and she was last seen on September 10th, 2001. She lived with her husband across the street from the World Trade Center, and they didn't see each other for like 24 hours. And she was a doctor, he was a doctor. There's all kinds of theories about her potentially running into the buildings to try to save people once the planes hit, but there's no real evidence for that. There's surveillance video of her at a store at like 7 o'clock the night before. So there's theories that she was actually, you know, something nefarious happened to her on the 10th, but it just was never looked into really because September 11th happened and she lived right across the street. So it's this really crazy missing persons case that I'm really fascinated by. And that sounds horrible. I shouldn't say fascinated. Like, I'm incredibly saddened by it, but I'm also like, my brain wants to know what happened.
Right.
Yeah, for me too is Alyssa Turney's story, and her sister Sarah Turney has been on a mission to try to find out what happened to her sister. Initially, you know, it was thought that her sister had run away when she was a senior in high school. And then as more evidence comes out, it starts really pointing to their father as having murdered her. And then there's a whole nother sort of explosive element to this where they find this arsenal of guns in his basement and contracts alleging to no sexual abuse happening. And it's a really twisty, turny story, but Alyssa's body has never been found. And so that's one that sort of haunts me too. And Sarah's doing an amazing job of really trying to put it all together and find justice for her sister.
Yeah.
Now, I know that y'all heard me say OCD earlier and having very little time, and now y'all just gave me like hours of stuff.
I know. Hours. I know.
Patrick, how did you get started in podcasting?
Oh, you know, I came to it as a fan, like a listener. In 2009, I had a long subway commute and I discovered podcasts. And I immediately became obsessed with them. Like, before I realized you could download them for free, I was buying the back catalog of This American Life on iTunes. And I spent like $200, and my husband was like, you know, you can get those for free, right? And I was like, no, how do you do that? And then I discovered this theater podcast that I was really obsessed with, and then it went away and nobody started doing it again. So I just was like, well, then I guess I'm going to do it. I was childless at the time, so I had extra time on my hands, and I wanted to learn how to make a podcast. And so I started making this Broadway podcast where I was interviewing these Broadway actors. And, you know, one thing, it was just like the podcasting was a perfect fit for me. I had never been so like creatively fulfilled. You know, I started building a small business making branded podcasts for companies, and I made one for Disney, and then I had a full-time job on top of it, and I got laid off, and my husband was like, you just need to figure out how to make a living doing this. You love it. You're never going to be happy doing anything else. And so I did. Yeah. And here we are all these years later.
Yeah. And how about you, Skye? Well, first of all, I did see, like I said, I was deep diving into you guys and, you know, checking you guys out. And I saw that you are working on Losing Bob. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yes, I was. That project is no longer happening.
Oh, no.
I know, it's unfortunate. So Losing Bob, this man who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, was choosing to try to find a way to die with dignity, to die on his own terms before he didn't remember anything anymore, before he forgot people that he loved, and was having just like zero luck. And there was this wonderful caregiver that was trying to find a way to make it happen, and looking into programs in Switzerland and looking into all of these different ways to help him die with dignity. And they couldn't find anything. And so he actually ended up taking his own life, you know, and that's how he found his dignity in dying. So, it would have been a very controversial story. I know there are many different ways that people feel about that type of situation. But so that one's no longer happening. It's a good reminder. I need to kind of remove that from public TV. Is that what you saw?
Yeah. Oh man, I'm sorry to hear about that, you know, because it seemed like, I mean, it is a very important story, I think, you know, and it's unfortunate that it ended that way. But is there anything?
It was the way he wanted it.
Yeah. And I guess there's grace in that, I want to say.
Yeah.
So what what else are you working on though?
Oh, there's.
I mean, because you do documentaries,
yes.
And have you done features as well?
I haven't directed scripted features. I've spent a lot of my career as a director of photography, behind the camera, making the visual decisions about how a story is going to look when it goes together. And I filmed a lot of scripted feature films. I would say probably in the past 5 to 7 years, I've really focused on documentaries. That's my true love. I just love meeting the people that are involved with the documentaries and kind of entering into these places that I would not normally enter into in my normal everyday life. You know, with scripted films, you kind of spend you're with actors and you're with crew people, and I love all of that, but it's not, you might be telling a different story, but the actual sort of community you're in isn't changing that much. And so I think I'm kind of a naturally curious person. So documentaries and meeting people that I probably wouldn't meet otherwise is the most interesting thing to me. So I've been busy. I mean, I'm working on an Oxygen documentary right now where we're editing that. That should be out in the summer or the fall. I've got 2 Netflix episodes on 2 different series that will be out this year in the very near future. And then there's a lot of stories that I have that I'm developing on my own that that I'm either going to take them out and pitch them or make them again as an independent film, because I think that, look, I love the independent film world, and I think that a lot of us are out there making independent films, and it's the ultimate freedom in one form, because we don't have someone telling us kind of what's going to suit an audience the best or what's going to do this, and you can really sort of throw yourself into it, and it can be, exactly your voice. The problem is financing. I mean, you've always got to find a way to kind of cobble it together. But I think that the independent film community is filled with amazingly talented people. I love the festival circuit, so I'd love to do another film that I could take out on the festival circuit and continue doing films with Netflix and Oxygen and Showtime and some of these other bigger platforms that kind of have a little bit of a broader reach. So keeping my hands in both territories.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we definitely like the independent films as well. We have been cultivating relationships with several here recently. We just interviewed Eric Smith Gunn and his wife Pam Smith last week. They are the writer, director, and executive producer of Hijab, which is on Amazon Prime. We've got some other interviews coming up with a lady out of Germany that just had her debut film. But me, growing up, I was like, how could people like documentaries? And then I hit about 30, and I think that's pretty much all I watch now is documentaries. Yeah, and true crime stuff. I have it on, Investigative Discovery or one of those, episodic shows. But the real one that I've liked so far, just like what you said, it's like Skye, is kind of the Netflix, the more in-depth kind of things instead of the series. The Making of a Murderer just really broke a lot of ground for Netflix and kind of opened the doors, I think. And I'm really hoping that we will see more opportunities for filmmakers like yourself to go into these stories that are lesser known, but that have such a human angle to them. And this story alone, I mean, you're main key players, but then there's also the sisters that are affected throughout this. Their childhoods are affected. But, very rarely do we get to see this many aspects, personalities that are affected by this guy, and over such a long period of time, because this guy didn't stop. After he was caught and already been convicted, he still was obsessed with Jan. And Patrick, like I said, I could see why this one really stuck in your craw, because I was the same way. Just like we were talking a minute ago about social media. When I first heard this story, first saw Abducted in Plain Sight, you're going, how in the hell could parents let that happen? And then that's why I was wondering about how the parents were being perceived now, because I had the same sort of experience Patrick did of going, wait a minute now, putting yourself in that timeline with what the time that B put in onto this family and everything that goes along with it. No, it doesn't excuse what happened, but I can definitely see how those dominoes fell into place. Like I said earlier, I'm really excited to hear the podcast because the show itself, it answers a lot of questions, but it does leave some more questions. We get some answers, but there's more questions.
Yeah.
Patrick, if you could tease one thing about the podcast, just one now, what would you tease?
Well, let's see. So I've already said that there's an insane plot line that happens. We push Jan on her dad's sexuality. Another thing is, Skye and I were having a conversation about after the movie came out. There was a story that came out in Vanity Fair about Marianne bringing a gun to one of her meetings with Berchtold when Jan was missing the second time. And Skye sort of teased that to Vanity Fair, and then the internet sort of exploded over it. We hear the story in Marianne's own words. We actually get that for the podcast. And then Skye sort of gives her interpretation of what that means. So that's another very fascinating thing to look out for.
I think really, to me, the most interesting thing, not the most interesting, but what I love about the podcast is people get to hear from Jan too, post film. They get to hear kind of her reflections on doing the film and and how she feels having this huge backlash come out against her parents, but kind of her motivation behind it and to hear from her kind of after the film. I think it may not be one of the juiciest details, but it's really nice to hear from Jan.
It is for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. With the release of her book and then the film, that really rips the Band-Aid off of it, and it breaks the ice, and it just makes talking about it that much easier, so I really give her a lot of credit for coming forth with her story and thanking you for really bringing it to a broader audience, because these are stories that people don't want to tell because of the shame or the embarrassment, and they need to be told because it's that thing, the more you know.
Yeah.
The more you talk about it, the easier it gets. That's part of it, and
that's therapy.
Yeah, exactly.
The one thing I was going to say too is that it's also great to hear from Skye because you don't get to hear from Skye in the movie at all. And we did an interview with Skye a long time ago before I got to know her. And, that's interesting. But this is really on the ground, getting to hear her talk to Jan again, which as a listener it was really fascinating because we all know that Skye has known Jan there's a lot of history there. So there's a lot of trust. Jan says things to Skye that she probably wouldn't say on The View or whatever. And it's, getting to hear Jan give a really interesting answer and then getting Skye's perspective on that answer is just fascinating.
Yeah, that's definitely an aspect that I'm looking forward to here because like you said, we don't get to see Skye in the film. Well, of course, we're getting her, her through her eyes, so to speak, but we never get to hear her voice. Even when a couple of times you hear somebody ask a question off camera, it's a male. It's one of the producers or somebody is asking the question, or the cameraman, whatever. And so that's definitely an aspect that I'm looking forward to. And Patrick, give your website where everybody can find the podcast, where they can find you so regularly, all that good stuff.
So the podcast is called Obsessed with Abducted in Plain Sight. Our website is obsessedwithpod.com. But you can go listen to the trailer right now. You can subscribe so you'll get all 4 episodes when they appear on Monday, but you can find it anywhere you find your podcast. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeart, anywhere you get your podcasts, it'll be there. So we're very excited.
And I'll also mention too, just to toot Patrick's horn a little bit, this is I think I might be wrong about this, but the kind of the first next podcast on the Obsessed Network. So there's an Obsessed Network.
We took the success of True Crime Obsessed and we've made a network so we can create more new shows like Obsessed with Abducted in Plain Sight, and we can also sort of support smaller shows and help bring them up. And that website is obsessednetwork.com. We're releasing, I think, 5 more original shows this year. So we're really excited. If you like the style of True Crime Obsessed, if you like true crime, you're going to like our shows. So Skye, thank you for saying that.
I did want to close with one question, and it's something that I try to do with everybody that I talk to, is what would you tell your younger self? What piece of advice, or, what would you tell your younger self?
Don't let fear stop you.
I mean, for me, I would say, like, working hard is the right thing. There was definitely a time when I thought that I was working hard and not enjoying my youth enough. But I look back and I really did enjoy my youth, and working hard, got me to a place where, like, I could be a podcaster for a living. So working hard, stay in school, kids.
Don't do drugs.
Crack is whack.